In a time of division and conflict, one rancher's decision to offer water to a wounded native warrior unfolds into a life-altering encounter that challenges everything he thought he knew about enemies and kinship. Crimson path led straight to his water well. The rancher, having spent 37 years on this harsh land, had seen enough injured animals to distinguish between a deer's blood and something far more grave yet. When he followed those stark drops around the corner of his barn, what he discovered caused his hand to freeze on his rifle. A young native fighter lay, slumped against the stone wall of his well-won hand, pressed desperately against a savage wound in his side, the other reaching weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just 3 feet above his head. The man's breathing came in ragged, agonizing gasps, and his dark eyes, though clouded with pain, tracked the rancher's every movement with the alertness of someone wary of demise from any quarter. This was 1847, the sort of year when discovering a native on your property meant one thing: peril, the kind of peril that could lead to a man being scalped in his sleep or burned alive in his own home. Every neighbor within 50 miles would offer the same counsel: finish the savage with a bullet to the head and bury him deep where no one would ever find the body. The rancher raised his rifle, his digit poised above the firing mechanism. It was the sensible action, the secure choice, the expected response. But something in those dark eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't merely pain he observed there. It was the same parching need he'd experienced during the drought of '44, when he'd gone 3 days without water and believed he might perish from it. The same human craving that surpassed all divisions of skin color, language, or which side of a conflict one was born into. The native tried to speak, his lips chapped and raw, but only a whisper emerged. Water. The rancher slackened his hold on the weapon, extending his arm for the pail. His neighbors would brand him a fool. His brother back east would declare he'd succumb to the isolation of the frontier. Hell, perhaps they'd be right. But as he crouched next to this injured stranger and pressed the wooden rim, his lips watching him drink like a man saved from drowning, the rancher grasped an undeniable truth. He was about to irrevocably alter the course of both their existences. What the rancher didn't know was that this wounded fighter was no ordinary individual among the local tribes, and what transpired next would draw an unprecedented number of horsemen to his ranch. The native drank like one who hadn't seen water in days, 3 full buckets before his shaking grip could finally hold the rim steady. Rancher observed every gulp, his mind racing with the ramifications of his deed in this territory. Extending clemency to a native was akin to signing one's own death warrant. But as color slowly returned to the warrior's face, the rancher noticed something that made his senses chill. The wound in the man's side wasn't from an animal attack or a hunting mishap. It was a gunshot wound, stark and actively seeping, and judging by the angle and the scorched marks indicating proximity, someone had shot him at close range, recent close range, which meant whoever had done this might still be looking for him, perhaps tracing the very same crimson path that led straight to the rancher's property, perhaps riding toward his homestead right now with firearms loaded. And questions the rancher couldn't answer. The native seemed to sense his fear. With great effort, he raised one hand and pointed toward the horizon, then made a cutting motion across his throat. His message was clear. Danger was approaching swiftly. The rancher felt his pulse thudding against his bones. Every instinct screamed at him to drag this wounded stranger away from his property, conceal the proof act, as if this encounter never occurred. But the man could barely sit up, let alone walk. Moving him now would likely kill him, and leaving him here was like marking them both for doom. That's when the rancher heard it, the sound that had kept him alive through 12 years of frontier living. The distant rhythm of hooves, multiple horses riding hard and fast, coming straight toward his ranch. The native heard them too. His gaze widened with unfeigned terror, and he tried to leverage himself against the well, as if shrinking might render him unseen. Blood immediately began seeping through his fingers, where he pressed them against his wound. The rancher grabbed the empty bucket and splashed water over the bloody track as quickly as he could, but there was no time to clean it all. The riders would be here in minutes. Perhaps less. He looked down at the injured warrior, this unfamiliar figure who had entered his existence and upended his reality in the span of a single afternoon, a man whose presence on his ranch could get them both killed, but whose dark eyes held something the rancher had never seen in a native before. Gratitude, unadulterated human thankfulness. The hoofbeats were getting closer, now close enough to count them. 5 horses, maybe 6, all moving at a pace that indicated no benign intent. The rancher decided in that fleeting moment, knowing it might be the last choice he ever made. He couldn't carry the wounded man, but he could hide him, the ancient root cellar behind the barn, if they could make it that far. But as he reached down to help the native to his feet, The warrior grasped his forearm with unexpected vigor and shook his head slowly. Then he did something that sent a shiver down his spine. He smiled, not the grateful smile of a man being saved, but the informed grin of someone who understood exactly who was coming over that hill. The riders came over the ridge like a tempest, bearing fury, 6 men on horseback, dirt swirling behind them, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. The rancher recognized the lead rider immediately, Marshal Dixon Webb, a man whose notoriety for brutality was widespread in every town from here to Santa Fe. Webb was the kind of lawman quick to use his gun, slow to inquire, especially when it came to native troubles, the kind who amassed scalps as macabre mementos, and called it justice, the kind who would burn down a ranch and everyone in it if he suspected them of harboring fugitives. The rancher stood in front of the well, his body blocking the native from view, attempting to appear as if he had no more pressing concern than mending a faulty fence. His throat was parched like a desert. Webb reined in his horse, just 10 feet away, close enough that the rancher could discern the chilling assessment in his pale blue eyes. The other 5 men fanned out in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. This was no social call. Afternoon, Hartwell, Webb said, his voice carrying the leisurely tone of one holding absolute dominance. We're tracing a wounded Indian blood trail. Leads right to your property. The rancher felt perspiration beading on his brow. Despite the cool evening air, haven't seen any Indians. Marshal been working on the south fence all day. Webb's eyes swept across the ranch, scanning every particular. The lawman overlooked nothing. It's what made him so dangerous. His gaze lingered on the dark stains in the dirt near the well, and the rancher felt his gut clench. Is that so? Webb descended from his mount with measured intent. Because that sure looks like blood to me, fresh blood. And unless you've been butchering cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently. Behind the rancher, hidden by the stone wall of the well, the wounded native remained perfectly still. But the rancher could feel the strain emanating from him like intense heat. One sound, one movement, and they were both doomed. Webb took 3 steps closer, his palm now resting unconcealed on his sidearm. You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives, don't you, Hartwell? It's the same penalty as for treason, a rope around the neck. Until dead. The words hung in the air like a verdict of demise. The rancher felt every muscle in his body taut as a coiled spring, ready to fight or run, knowing neither option would save them. Webb was too close now. Any sudden movement would expose the native, and once that happened, lead would begin to fly. That's when an unbelievable occurrence transpired. The wounded native spoke, not in English, but in his native tongue, a string of words that rang out like a melody, distinct and powerful despite his injuries, phrases that made Marshal Webb freeze mid-step, and his complexion drained of all hue like liquid from a ruptured container. Webb's hand fell away from his pistol. His jaw worked wordlessly, resembling a fish out of water. And when he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a breath. Dear God, you're him. The other 5 riders immediately dismounted their arms, neglected their faces, showing the same mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear, but not the kind of terror men show when facing an enemy, the kind of terror of those who grasp monumental blunder. Webb turned to the rancher, his face now ashen as a winter landscape. Do you have any idea who you've been helping? The rancher stared at Marshal Webb's terrified face. His thoughts reeled like a cartwheel mired in mire in 12 years of frontier living. He'd never seen the merciless enforcer display any apprehension, not outlaws, not wild animals, not even the Apache war parties that had reduced 3 settlements to cinders just last summer. But now Webb looked as if he'd encountered Spectre. The wounded native spoke again, this time in perfect English, his tone possessing a command that permeated the whole homestead. Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me. Webb's larynx convulsed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice fractured like an adolescent's. This is Anna, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson. Last spring, the rancher felt the earth seem to tilt under him. Peace treaty, the same accord that had halted 3 years of savage conflict between the settlers and the Apache, the same agreement that had preserved countless lives on opposing fronts, the same treaty that had rendered the land safe for families to settle in this territory without fear of midnight raids, and he'd been watering the man who'd made it all possible. But if Anna was a peacemaker, why was he fleeing from justice with a slug in his flank? There was an ambush. Anna continued. His respiration remained strained, but his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty to include the southern territories, but Morrison harbored different intentions. Webb's face went from ashen to leaden. Colonel Morrison is dead, shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder. Because that's what they want you to believe, Anna said, leveraging himself to a more upright position against the well. Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men donning battle markings, speaking just enough of the tribal tongue to deceive onlookers, men who knew exactly when and where we would meet. The ramifications struck the rancher like a tangible impact. Someone had orchestrated Morrison's demise to incriminate Anna, someone who sought the dissolution of the accord, someone who desired the land to ignite once more. Who? Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Anna's dark gaze sharpened like obsidian. The same men who have been selling guns to the renegade tribes, the same men who have been amassing wealth from this conflict, the same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of looking for the real killers. Webb took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his firearm before stopping. You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations, and they'll remain mere allegations until I can substantiate them, Anna replied, which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow, why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead, why they're counting on men like you to finish what they started. The rancher watched this exchange with mounting dread. He'd thought he was just helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he'd found himself ensnared in a widespread plot that could rend the whole region asunder. But what most deeply unsettled him was the realization that if Anna was telling the truth, then Marshal Webb hadn't come here to arrest fugitive. He'd come here to perpetrate an assassination. A heavy quiet hung stretched thin like a strained cord about to snap. Webb's 5 men stirred uneasily in their seats, hands hovering near weapons, gazes flickering between their superior and the injured native, who just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. The rancher could see the internal conflict raging within Webb's perception. The lawman was caught between obligation and veracity, between directives and morality, and men like Webb rarely resolved ethical quandaries. Typically, they were silenced by lead. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said slowly, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back dead or alive. His demise would be simpler, Anna replied, his tone unwavering despite the agony lining his features. Dead men cannot bear witness. Dead men cannot reveal who really benefits from another Indian war. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with an anxious gaze, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty. Shut up, Bradley, Webb snapped, but the rancher could see uncertainty seeping into the lawman's demeanor like fissures in a failing dam. That's when Anna unveiled his ultimate gambit. Reaching into a leather pouch at his belt with shaking digits, he pulled out a folded, blood-marked document. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison written the night before he died. Webb regarded the missive as if it might spontaneously combust. What does it say? It says Morrison discovered who's been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes, names, dates, amount sufficient proof to condemn a score of individuals. Anna's eyes never left Webb's face, including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been accepting illicit payments to ignore transgressions. The words struck Webb with tangible force. His face went through several shades of pale before settling on a bilious hue behind him. His men shared uneasy looks, abruptly preoccupied with their horses. Monets. The rancher felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He was observing an event that threatened all their lives. The moment when an unscrupulous law enforcer understood his own life was imperiled. You're lying, Webb said, but his voice was devoid of certainty. Anna held up the document. Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died, told me to get it to Fort Richardson. If anything happened to him, said it was insurance. Webb took a step forward, his hand now gripping his pistol. Give me that letter so you can eradicate it. Anna shook his head. I don't think so, Marshal, but I'll propose a bargain. Let me live long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll make sure your involvement remains unstated. When these revelations surfaced, the offer lingered in the air like gunsmoke. The rancher could see Webb assessing probabilities, balancing dangers, trying to figure out which choice would keep him alive longer. But what transpired next surprised everyone. Deputy Bradley descended from his horse and walked slowly toward the well, his palms presented openly in a gesture of peace. Marshal, I've been thinking about something. Remember that consignment of firearms that disappeared 3 months ago? The one we were told was stolen by Indians. Webb's face darkened. What about it? I saw those same rifles 2 weeks later in the hands of settlers heading south. Bradley's young face was flushed with either courage or fear. Made me wonder who was really stealing from whom. The admission fractured the solidarity of the group. Suddenly other deputies were nodding, sharing glances, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. And the rancher realized that Anna had just achieved something extraordinary without firing a shot or raising his voice. He had swayed Webb's own subordinates to defy him. But Webb wasn't the kind of man who went down without a fight. and when trapped, hazardous individuals resorted to perilous actions. Webb's hand tightened on his pistol grip until his knuckles blanched. A cornered creature was always the most dangerous, and the rancher could see the exact moment when the lawman decided that bullets were simpler than truth. "You're all fools." Webb snarled, his veneer of composure finally fractured. "You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dead Indian?" And a handful of traitors, the deputies instinctively fanned out hands, moving toward their weapons. But the rancher could see the hesitation on their countenances. Years of following orders clashed with the dawning awareness that those orders might be wrong. Iana struggled to his feet, using the stone well for support. Blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed them against his wound. But his voice remained steady. "The veracity is indifferent to its speaker, Marshal. It simply exists. The truth," Webb spat, "is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm going to claim the reward for your capture." He produced his sidearm with fluid grace, the barrel swinging toward Iana. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into the line of fire, his own weapon raised. "Stand down, Marshal." The words boomed like a clap of thunder across the ranch. 4 other deputies followed Bradley's lead, their guns trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained loyal to Webb, a weathered old-timer named Hawkins, who appeared as dishonest as his superior. "You're making a mistake, boys," Webb said, though perspiration now dotted his brow. "A mistake that'll strip you of your authority, perhaps your very existence." "Perhaps," Bradley replied. "But I've erred sufficiently by obeying your directives. I shall cease to do so." The rancher watched this standoff with mounting apprehension. 6 armed men in his ranch yard, all aiming firearms at one another, each certain of their righteousness. This was how territorial feuds ignited. This was the manner in which honorable men perished for ignoble causes. That's when Iana did something unexpected. He began to sing, not in English, but in Apache, a deep, evocative tune that appeared to emerge from the very soil. The timeless lyrics echoed over the ranch like currents through gorges, telling of valor and self-denial, of kin united against adversity. The effect was instantaneous and astonishing. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, not understanding the words, but feeling their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily captivated by the auditory display. And while they listened transfixed, Anna was doing something else entirely. He was summoning his kinsmen. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind. To ears that knew how to listen, the rancher realized this with a shiver that traced his spine like frigid liquid. Anna wasn't just singing, he was invoking aid. The melody ended, and quiet settled over the ranch like a ponderous shroud. But in that silence, the rancher heard something that made his blood curdle. Hoofbeats, distant, but growing closer, many hoofbeats moving fast. Webb heard them too. His complexion turned ashen as lunar glow. How many? Anna smiled. Despite his pain, enough. The sound grew louder, intensifying until it resembled distant thunder across the prairies. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. A full Apache raiding group was riding toward the rancher's homestead, and they would arrive within minutes. Webb raised his pistol again, this time pointing it directly at the rancher's chest. "You did this, you helped him alert them." "I gave a dying man water," the rancher replied, surprised by the composure in his tone. "Same as I do for any distressed being on my domain." The hoofbeats were close enough now to sense in the earth underfoot, close enough to count, too many to count. And Webb finally grasped Anna's entire stratagem. They came over the horizon like a spectacle. From an ethereal realm, 50 Apache warriors on horseback, moving in flawless alignment, their battle pigments shining in the fading sun. But as they drew closer, the rancher realized something that challenged all his prior notions about native raiding groups. They weren't coming for battle. At the head of the group rode an elderly chief whose presence exuded reverence from 100 paces. His gray hair was interwoven with avian plumes, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the gravitas of one who had never yielded. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from veteran combatants to youthful warriors barely able to wield arms, but their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face shifted through bewilderment, dread, and frantic assessment. He still held his pistol trained on the rancher, but his grip trembled as if gripped by ague. "This changes nothing. I still have my orders." "Your orders," came a new voice, "are no longer valid." Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley, holding up an authoritative-looking parchment. "This came through this morning, Marshal, issued directly by the regional executive. All pursuit of Anna is halted until an inquiry into Colonel Morrison's demise." Webb's face deepened with fury. "You lying wretch, inspect your own dispatch pouch," Bradley interrupted. "Unless you've been too busy amassing rewards to review your official dispatches." The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not menacing, but undeniably their chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the well where his son waited. With each step, the old man's gaze fixed on Anna's countenance, seeking Indicators of grave harm when father and son embraced a shared exhalation seemed to emanate from the gathered fighters. The rancher found himself beholding something hallowed. The conjunction of a chief with his tribe, a parent with his progeny, a peacemaker with those he pledged to safeguard. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his calloused hands, examining the injury, his expression etched with profound worry. Anna responded in the same language, but the rancher discerned sufficient English interspersed to grasp the essence. The truth, the plot, the names of the real killers. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with a gaze like polished jet. When he spoke, his English was flawless. An exact marshal. Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him. Webb's pistol quivered. I came here to arrest a fugitive from your own depravity. The chief replied, a man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been benefiting from conflict between our nations. The charge lingered in the air like vapor from a pyre. Webb's remaining ally Hawkins was gradually withdrawing his steed away from the circle, clearly assessing his prospects of flight. You have no proof, Webb said, but his voice faltered on his utterance. The chief smiled not warmly, but with the contentment. One possessing all advantages. We have Morrison's letter. We have the confessions of the true assailants who revealed all before perishing in an attempt to evade our retribution. And we have something else. He gestured to one of his warriors who rode forward carrying a leather pouch from it. The warrior produced a pile of documents that rendered Webb's face pallid. Your communication with the arms dealers, the chief continued. Every payment, every shipment, every falsehood uttered to obscure your trail. Morrison was more diligent than you realized. Webb's reality crumbled in that instant. The rancher watched a dishonest individual comprehend that all his machinations, all his brutality, all his perfidies had been in vain. The proof was undeniable, the witnesses trustworthy, the reckoning inescapable, but entrapped creatures were erratic. Webb aimed his sidearm at the chief, despair overwhelming rationality. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. What transpired next moved with blinding speed. Anna propelled himself between the weapon and his sire. Despite his wound, the handgun discharged, and 50 Apache fighters instinctively drew their arms in flawless coordination. But the bullet missed its mark, because the rancher, a plain homesteader who merely sought to aid a parched soul, had grappled Marshal Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a jumble of grit and fury. The grit settled like a final curtain. Descending on a dramatic performance, Webb lay inert beneath the rancher, his sidearm flung away by the collision deputy Bradley, and his men quickly apprehended both Webb and Hawkins, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. But it was the subsequent event that would forever mark the rancher's memory. The chief walked slowly to where the rancher sat, regaining his composure on the dusty ground. The old man's aged countenance remained inscrutable as he studied this white rancher who had jeopardized all for an unknown individual. Then, without warning, he rested both palms upon the rancher's shoulders, uttering Apache phrases imbued with ceremonial gravity, profound respect and acknowledgement. Anna translated his tone heavy with sentiment. He says, "You are now kinsmen of our tribe. What you did today, extending clemency to an adversary imperiling your existence for veracity, opting for bravery over apprehension. These are the deeds of an authentic combatant." The rancher felt a sensation stir within his breast, like a portal opening to admit an unfamiliar radiance. All his life he'd been instructed that natives were uncivilized antagonists, hindrances to progress. But gazing into the elder's ancient eyes, he perceived only sagacity, nobility, and a caliber of esteem he had never garnered from his own kin. The ritual that ensued was unlike anything the rancher had ever observed. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a circle around him. One by one they approached and touched his hand, not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, an acknowledgement of shared bond that rose above race or custom. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented the rancher with a present that left him breathless, a battle spear adorned with aquiline plumes and detailed bead artistry, its handle polished by countless hands across generations. "This was possessed by my ancestor," the chief explained, "and his forefather before him. It has never been borne by one not of Apache birth, until today, as the sun set over the western mountains, imbuing the firmament with hues of amber and scarlet. The Apache, made ready to leave Anna's injury, had been duly attended to by the tribal healer, and though he was still infirm, he would survive to witness the accord's extension, and the genuine plotters brought to reckoning before mounting his horse. Anna grasped the rancher's hand. "A last time you preserved more than my existence today, kinsman. You preserved the harmony between our tribes. I merely offered water to a parched individual," the rancher replied. "Sometimes," Anna smiled, That's how the world transforms a single draft at a time 24 hours later exactly, as the tale had promised they vanished, yet they bequeathed. Something invaluable. Evidence that in a realm saturated with animosity and dread straightforward human kindness could still enact wonders. Webb and Hawkins faced trial, and were found guilty of sedition, malfeasance, and complicity. In assassination, the illicit arms trade was disrupted, and the peace treaty was not merely reinstated, but broadened to encompass all native groups of the region, and the rancher, a plain homesteader who had shown mercy to a stranger, became the first Caucasian male in regional annals to be formally inducted into the Apache Collective, because sometimes in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the most significant conflicts were not triumphed by firearms or aggression, but by something far more powerful: the bravery to perceive adversaries as fellow mortals, and the sagacity to select empathy over apprehension.